Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's Women's History Month agenda for the week of March 14, 2026, with today's central theme, Women on War and Black Folk. We commence with a clip of former 6-time Georgia Congresswoman Dr. Cynthia McKinney on U.S. funding Jews to Israel, followed by our sister Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Elizabeth Schmidt, Professor Emeritus of History at Loyola University at Maryland and author of the book Foreign Intervention in Africa. After the Cold War, Sovereignty, Responsibility, and the War on Terror, today the topic is Somalia. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Reena Goldthree, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of the book Democracy's Foot Soldiers, World War I and the Politics of Empire in the Greater Caribbean. We have 2 announcements. Tomorrow, Sunday, March 15th, from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., is the Black Women Are Divine event, which is a reclamation in honor of Breonna Taylor. Everything is free for Black women and girls. There's food, music, special guest performances, healing services, and Children's Village. Again, this is tomorrow at the Norman Houston Park at Stalker and La Brea. There's parking and shuttle at the Crenshaw Mall on the Stalker Street side, so you can go to Black Lives Matter Los Angeles online for more details. Also happening next week, Wednesday, March 18th, at Vroman's Bookstore in Pasadena, Mopreme Shakur is in discussion with UCLA Professor of American History, Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly, for a Q&A and book signing of Mopreme's new book, This Thug's Life, An Unapologetically Black History. That's at 7 p.m., Wednesday, March 18th at Vroman's in Pasadena. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Alice Coltrane, Madison Cali, Les Nubians, Patrice Rushen, Esperanza Spalding, prison radio commentaries, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution. And now we go to a clip of former 6-time Georgia Congresswoman Dr. Cynthia McKinney on the U.S. funding Jews to Israel.
With this experience, then I began to do something that's revolutionary in the U.S. Congress. And that is, I began to read every bill. So I began to read the bills, And I became the ranking member of one of the subcommittees on operations for the State Department. So that meant that the State Department authorization bill I was responsible for, and if I was going to put my name on it, I was going to read it and know what was in it. Well, I found all kinds of little nuggets in there. Like, do you know that at least at that time, that any Jew who wanted to move to Israel was moved to Israel from any place on the planet at U.S. taxpayers' expense. It's a $30 million fund within the State Department. And that was just one of the things I found. And I asked the staff, the House International Relations Committee staff, well, what happens if they don't use up all the money? Then they get the appropriation for the next year, and it just adds to whatever is there.
Chimiranga. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now's calendar of historical events of heroes and sheroes for the week of March 14th. This weekly presentation is to honor and guide us in our continued struggle for liberation from the tri-forces of class, national, and gender oppression. March 14th, 1883. Karl Marx, the leading doctrinaire on the critique of capitalism and the inevitable contradiction between labor, or the workers, and capital, or the capitalists, dies. Karl Marx, the father of Marxism, one of the major components of revolutionary socialist ideology used to liberate Russia, Cuba, Vietnam, China, among more than 60 countries in the world, with its searing analysis of the fundamental anti-social essence of capitalism. March 15, 1961. The Bakongo clan of West Africa rise against the Portuguese and took control of northern Angola, though temporarily defeated with over 50,000 deaths and over 300,000 fled to the Congo. The freedom-loving warriors regrouped and inevitably organized under the leadership of the Movement for the Liberation of Angola, and not only overthrew colonial government, but set in motion the overthrow of the dictatorship of Portugal and the rise of a socialist government inside Europe. March 17, 1966. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta lead the first march to Sacramento by the National Farm Workers Association, which represented all farm workers, Africans in the United States, Haitians, though the dominant ethnic groupings were Mexicans. March 16, 1810. Africans in Oklahoma immigrate to Alberta, Canada as a stepping stone to repatriation to Africa. March 16, 1879. Huda Sharawi, a pioneer in the Egyptian women's rights and independence movement, was born. She was a leader in the anti-British colonial movement, realizing that the feudal practices of Egypt were kept stagnated by British colonialism. March 18, 1963. The French government tests atomic weapons in the Sahara on the first anniversary of the end of the Algerian War, where they were defeated. March 19, 1962. France was defeated after one of the bloodiest colonial wars in the history of humankind. Over 1 million Africans died in the successful war to free their homeland Algeria from the European capitalist pigs, after spending decades in nonviolent civil actions, which further entrenched French colonialism. The organization of the National Liberation Front of Algeria provided the decisive organizational weapon for the destruction of French colonialism. March 20th, 1896. Ethiopia defeats the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, the only country in Africa that was never colonized. Europeans who at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885 divided Africa for exploitation and enslavement on the basis of divine destiny and the notion that they were to Christianize Africa, though Ethiopia was the first Christian empire in the world. March 20th, 1890. Lawson, Native American sister who was a reconnaissance expert, skilled markswoman, healer, shaman, and emissary to Geronimo, honored Chiriquai Apache warrior who was a leader in her people's struggle to survive in the face of white supremacy. She died as a captured prisoner of war in the United States fascist military barracks by torture. This has been Sister Luyanda with our Revolutionary African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at KPFK 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and streaming live on the World Wide Web, kpfk.org. Please check out Freedom Now's listing of over 35 prior programs at kpfk.org. We want to praise up our revolutionary ancestors who have made our present existence possible by hailing up the words of our Azanian sisters and brothers. Power to the people. Amandla.
Awetu.
Amandla.
Awetu.
Amandla. Awetu.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Elizabeth Schmidt, Professor Emeritus of History at Loyola University of Maryland, author of the book Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War, Sovereignty, Responsibility, and the War on Terror. And today our topic will be Somalia. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Elizabeth Schmidt.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be with you all.
And we're pleased to have you. So how is it that the unrest in Minneapolis and St. Paul has roots in the Cold War?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, Trump's crackdown on Somali refugees and immigrants and even U.S. citizens of Somali descent in Minnesota has made this situation headline news. Even though many people think that this is the first sort of crackdown or discrimination against Somalis, they're quite wrong, as we'll discover as we go through this program today. But there is a huge community of Somalis in the Twin Cities, 80,000 people of Somali heritage, including some who were citizens, some who were born in the U.S. And it made headline news because 3,000 immigration and customs enforcement people were going through the streets of Minneapolis, targeting Somalis among other immigrants. And yet it didn't get really headline news until 2 American citizens were killed, both of whom were white. And so I felt that it was really important to get the word out there as to why there are so many Somalis in the United States and how they, came to be in Minneapolis. There's another large group in Lewiston, Maine, where there's also been an ICE crackdown, so we should keep that in mind. Minneapolis is also, as Professor Horne has referenced, the congressional district for Ilhan Omar, who was born in Somalia, but is, of course, a U.S. citizen now, and our member of Congress. And she's one of Trump's most forceful and outspoken critics. So he's really, really disliked her. And, you may know that he already has disparaged Somalis and other Africans. In his first administration, he referred to their countries as shithole countries. He's labeled Somalis in the United States and their descendants as garbage, and they should go home and fix their problems. He's dehumanized them in this way, which is a tactic that was employed by Nazis in Hitler's Germany. to justify their murders. So I think we need to be really cautious and take a look at this very seriously. Now, what happened in the first administration was Somalia had gotten its independence in 1960, and it had a democratic government for a while. Then there was a military coup. Siad Barre, a military officer, came to power and declared that Somalia would follow a socialist orientation. And in fact, there were some big strides for poor Somalis who've been less privileged in the past. They were given much more access to health care, to primary education, to jobs. But the government was also extremely paranoid about getting overthrown and cracked down very hard on all opposition. There was censorship, there's imprisonment, there was clan rivalry that Siad Barre used to play one group against the other group. So it was not a good situation at all. Now, I want to bring in a couple other countries. Ethiopia, at that point, was in the U.S. camp. It was a valued partner during the World War II and after the war, under Haile Selassie, who was really a feudal empire builder. So there was a military coup in 1974 in Ethiopia that brought to power a military government that ultimately declared that it was not just socialist, it was Marxist-Leninist. And so through that sort of complicated period, Ethiopia moved into the Soviet orbit, and Somalia moved back into the US orbit, where it built one of the largest armies in Africa. Again, very brutal, cracked down hard on dissent, but now a US ally. So as the Cold War ended, the US essentially said, we don't really need a regional policeman anymore. Boy, Somalia is really engaging in a lot of very serious human rights depredations, and we don't want anything to do with it, so we're going to cut off our aid, military aid, and our economic aid. And this led to mayhem because Somalia had no political parties. There'd been a stifling of the grassroots. So this mayhem resulted in essentially rivalry between different warlords heading different clan militias, trying to get national power. And if you want, I can move into that too, in terms of the damage done to Somalia that led to the current state during the War on Terror. Should I?
Well, let me intervene and just recapitulate, meaning that in the Horn of Africa, East Africa, you have the nation of Somalia.
Yeah.
And during the Cold War, for a while, it was a U.S. ally, but after the overthrow of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I in neighboring Ethiopia, a left-leaning regime came to power, and the Somali regime under Siad Barre, previously pursuing a so-called non-capitalist path of development, is wooed into a war against Ethiopia, principally over nationalist ambition, the so-called Ogaden Desert, for example. And that is the trigger that leads to the decomposition of Somalia, which then leads to a massive refugee outflow, ultimately to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is now the site of 80,000 or more folk of Somali ancestry, including Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, a staunch critic of Mr. Trump. But to return to East Africa, there was also an incident that was the premise for a Hollywood film. I'm speaking of Black Hawk Down. Could you talk to us about that?
Yes. I'm happy to get to that. Yes, so the conflict between the competing warlords destroyed much of Mogadishu, Somalia's capital, in 1991 and 1992. State institutions and basic services crumbled, the formal economy ceased to function, and southern Somalia disintegrated into these fiefdoms ruled by warlords and their militias. As this happened, war-induced famine emerged. People weren't able to farm in the fields. The rival militias were forcing people to give up their food, using food as a weapon of war, or the deprivation of food as a weapon of war. They stole their livestock. There was also climate change-induced crop failure. So 4.5 million people were at the risk of starvation in late 1992. And the United Nations backed a U.S. U.S.-led but multinational military intervention in 1992 that was to ensure the delivery of humanitarian relief. But a second UN mission that was also a military mission, also led by the U.S., in early 1993 allowed U.S. forces to disarm and arrest Somali warlords and militia members. So they're two different missions with two very different purposes. And the U.S. sort of forged ahead with the mission to disarm and arrest the warlords. But in so doing, it became a party to one actor had really become a civil war, and the enemy of others. So they picked their warlord, and they picked Ali Mahdi Mohammed, and he was opposing another named Mohammed Farah Aidid. And so the U.S. went out after Aidid on behalf of Ali Mahdi Mohammed. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Many of them were killed in U.S. airstrikes, including elders, clan and religious leaders, intellectuals, and businessmen who were meeting to consider a U.S. peace accord. So it was really, really a bad situation. Now, the film you were referring to, Black Hawk Down, is a follow-up to that directly. The final raid to try to capture Aidid himself, but certainly his militia members, took place in October 1993. And the Aidid forces shot down 2 Black Hawk helicopters, which crashed into the children below. And angry crowds attacked the surviving soldiers and those that were attempting to rescue them, and dragged their bodies through the streets. So a total of 18 American soldiers and hundreds of Somali men, women, and children were killed in the ensuing violence. So at this point, it was the Bill Clinton administration in 1994, and they just said, okay, we didn't send American boys to die in Somalia, we're getting out. And so they hastily withdrew and left Somalia to its own devices, much of which had been stirred up by the United States. However, the emergence of Al-Qaeda elsewhere in East Africa sparked new U.S. concerns. First of all, in 1998, Al-Qaeda bombed the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And then, of course, the 9/11 attacks in 2001 led the U.S. To increase collaboration with Somalia's longtime nemesis, Ethiopia. So that opened the chapter that was discussed in Black Hawk Down. That was really, though, to be a little critical of the film, although it was very powerful, it was more powerful about the brotherhood of the American forces rather than what is it that's going on in Somalia? Why is this happening? That really is not explored in the film.
Now, to fast forward to the present,
Yes.
the Horn of Africa has been much in the news of late because there's a breakaway province from the larger Somalia known as Somaliland. And of late, the Israeli authorities have sought to open relations with Somaliland to the consternation of the internationally recognized regime in Mogadishu, speaking of the larger Somalia, which, by the way, is backed avidly by Turkey or Turkiya. And could you bring us up to speed on current events in the Horn of Africa, particularly Somaliland and Somalia?
Okay, thanks. Well, in 1991, when Siad Barre was ousted, after the U.S. withdrew its support and the central government disintegrated, Somaliland, which had been, like Puntland, a semi-autonomous region within the country, it declared independence. That is, now we're talking about Somaliland. Now, it's an interesting territory. It's strategically located along the Gulf of Aden, which is the gateway for Europe for Middle Eastern oil. And as such, it's been under attack by Houthi rebels from Yemen in recent years, and the recipient of Trump's hundreds of air and naval strikes during the first year in his second term in office, when he was striking Somalia with airstrikes. The city of Berbera in Somaliland is home to one of the longest landing strips in Africa, along with a port. And they're very much coveted by the Trump administration, not only to offer the U.S. a strong presence on the oil shipping route, but also to enable the U.S. to monitor conflicts in the region, so kind of a spy post. New studies have shown that Somaliland has numerous deposits of rare earth minerals that have not yet been claimed or exploited. So you know what that means for the Trump administration. They want it, and they wanted to buy Greenland, but Somaliland they're just willing to take effectively. I mean, take control of it, but it perhaps in the future recognizing its independence. Now, Somaliland wants to exchange these maritime military facilities in Berbera, including access to the airstrip, for international recognition of Somaliland as an independent state. And they hope that the U.S. will recognize Somaliland soon, and that this will stimulate widespread recognition by other states, resulting in increased foreign investment and security agreements. Now, Israel became the first country to step up to the plate, and recently, in December 2025, became the first country to recognize Somaliland as an independent state. It certainly wants to expand the number of Muslim majority countries that have joined the diplomatic ties with Israel, as in the Trump-brokered Abraham Accords, but also has spoken to Somaliland about resettling Palestinians from Gaza in a forced relocation move, which is another clear violation of international law. Trump also hopes that the addition of military facilities in Somaliland, which is one of the few African governments that recognizes Taiwan rather than Beijing, and that this will weaken China's stronghold on the continent. All of this has led Somalia in return to do its best to keep Trump in their camp. The Somali government has hired a lobbying firm with strong GOP ties to help it regain access to Trump. And in March 2025, the Somali president offered the United States exclusive control of the two air bases and two ports, including the port and air base in Berbera.
Well, Professor Elizabeth Schmidt, Professor Emeritus of History at Loyola University in Maryland, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
And up next are prison radio commentaries.
The war before the war. As bombs explode and wreak havoc across the Middle East, one wonders, what will come of this? This question arises because of events that happened over 70 years ago, 1953 to be exact, when spies from the CIA and British intelligence hatched a plan to remove Iran's democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, removed from power because he supported the nationalization of his country's vast oil reserves. The spies, acting on behalf of U.S. and British oil companies, used their puppet, the Shah of Iran, to declare that Mossadegh be held on house arrest, which sparked wide anti-Shah protests in the country. This imperial plot of regime change by foreigners sparked the subsequent revolution in Iran that forced the Shah into exile some years later and led to the rise of the rule of the clerics. Regime change can lead to unexpected consequences. For as history has taught us, regime change can become the mother of revolutions. So be careful what you wish for. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio. What's really behind the war that's happening on our TV screens and on our devices? In a word, it's money. When you think about what happened in Venezuela, think not of the kidnapping of the president and his wife, or even the imposition of the vice president. Think about the tons of oil that was taken and shipped to the United States. War is always about natural resources. It always has been. It always will be. Because natural resources are the properties upon which corporations make their loot. Wars are about power, money, ego, but always about money. And when you see what's happening in Iran, don't be surprised if a vast amount of oil disappears, because ultimately, that's what they thirst for. That's what they're interested in. Not the people of Iran, not even the leaders of Iran, but the natural resources of Iran. Were it not for the natural resources of the Middle East, there wouldn't be an American in the whole area, not to mention a corporation. When you ask what it's about, remember, it's about money. With love, not fear, this is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio. Hey, y'all. We're supposed to be here to celebrate the 73rd birthday of Kamal Sadiki, a black political prisoner, a former member of the Black Panther Party in New York and in other parts of the country, a former BLA soldier, an esteemed martial arts teacher, a father and a grandfather, and a man that is still in the custody of the state with serious health issues, who's partially blind, but still a freedom fighter, no matter where he is. We're here to talk about him, to remember him, to salute him, and to ask all within earshot to support him and his loving family who want him free. Free Kamal Sadiki. As I mentioned earlier, this is his 73rd birthday. But it's more than that. Kamal Sadiki is in prison for refusing to bend to the state, and he was framed on a 30-year-old murder case where exculpatory evidence of his innocence was illegally excluded from the trial and therefore from the jurors before him. He has been fighting for freedom for almost all of his life. That fight continues, but it continues only if you support the Free Kamal Sadiki campaign. I urge you to join it and make it come to life. Make it do what it do. I salute you, brother, with love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Reena Goldthree, Associate Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of the book Democracy's Foot Soldiers, World War I and the Politics of Empire in the Greater Caribbean. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Reena Goldthree.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to talk about the book with you.
And we're excited to have you. So why did you produce this book?
So I'm a historian who focuses on Black social movements in Latin America and the Caribbean with a focus on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I'm really interested in the ways in which, in the Caribbean context, regular folks, so laboring people, often in relatively small organizations, challenged or negotiated with colonial rule. So I initially was very interested in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, the organization co-founded by Amy Ashwood and Marcus Garvey. And as I started kind of researching that organization and its early efforts, I was immediately struck by how many of the kind of early efforts of the UNIA and many of the men who would become very prominent in the organization had kind of a tie to World War I, either had served in the war as soldiers, or in the case of Marcus Garvey, had recruited men to serve in the war. And I saw that this was the case also with many of the most acclaimed labor union leaders across the British Caribbean, and some of the men who founded the first major political parties in the region as well. And so that led me to kind of ask a series of questions about World War I and its transformative political impact in the greater Caribbean. So that's what took me to this book, is really a desire to understand, what did the war mean for Black laboring people in the Caribbean? How did they understand themselves participating in a war for democracy, a democracy that of course was denied to them at home as colonial subjects? And what did they hope to achieve through military service?
Now, apparently there were 16,000 soldiers from Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and surrounding islands who fought for the British Empire during this conflict, 1914 to 1918. And we know that in Ireland, for example, dissidents seized the opportunity to engage in what was called the Easter Uprising to challenge British rule. were there similar sorts of uprisings and expressions of dissent in the so-called British Caribbean?
Yes, but they looked different than the kind of mass uprising that historians have so thoroughly documented in Ireland. What was interesting about the kind of so-called British Caribbean context is that initially the British War Office did not want to recruit soldiers from the Caribbean, right? They were deeply concerned about the reality of what would have been and what ended up being, of course, a majority Black regiment, and what that would mean given the British Army's explicit color bar in terms of who could enter the officer class. Only men of so-called unmixed European blood could qualify as officers. And that contradicted the kind of myth of racial equality that was part of the kind of propaganda in the British Empire for World War I. So unlike kind of efforts at conscription in Ireland, there was never anything similar to conscription implemented in the British Caribbean. Instead, the British West Indies Regiment was an all-volunteer force, right? Which meant that the men who ultimately served argued that they had an even greater claim to compensation because, as one of the Black newspaper writers famously wrote, we enlisted not because of the lash, but because of love, right? And so there were kind of great debates among Black workers and Black intellectuals about participating in the war. There were certainly local forms of dissent that were often really harshly crushed. So examples of when recruits would march through the streets in places like Kingston, Jamaica, and Port of Spain, Trinidad, local dissidents would heckle them, call them German targets, publicly question why they were going off to a war on the other side of the world. And then certainly during and after the war, soldiers and veterans themselves led several mass demonstrations, most notably a massive uprising in Belize town, now Belize City, the capital of modern day Belize, where in July of 1919, around a third of the entire city, led by returning veterans, marched in the streets, led a full-scale urban rebellion that was so fierce that the colonial governor and the kind of white elites retreated to the governor's mansion, and the governor wrote that he was prepared to haul down the British flag. But what I explain in my book, and this kind of the episode in Belize really highlights this, is that there was a constant tension both during the war and after the war between soldiers and civilians who kind of had a more militant approach and those who were ultimately reformist in their kind of politics, right? So in the case of this massive uprising that I mentioned that happened in the streets in Belize in July of 1919, ultimately it was a group of reformist veterans led by a man named Samuel Haynes, who is now most famous for his work as a Garveyite and as the author of the national anthem of Belize. Samuel Haynes was actually a part of a group of reformist veterans who put down this popular rebellion, said that it was a kind of threat to law and order, and actually advocated for working within the system instead of these kind of popular street demonstrations.
Staying on Belize, the former British Honduras, a two-part question. Is there any insight with regard to why was there such an upsurge in Belize of all places, and perhaps not in Jamaica, which has this justified reputation for militancy stretching back centuries? And a moment or two ago, you also mentioned that Marcus Garvey was recruiting for the British Empire military during the war. Now you tell us that Garveyite helps to put down a rebellion. Any speculation or insight with regard to that?
Sure, these are terrific questions. So for the case of Belize, which is there are kind of several reasons why I think that the largest single uprising happens there. One is that while the kind of overall number of soldiers from Belize was relatively small, given its population, it was just a few hundred soldiers, it actually had the highest enlistment rate per capita in the British Caribbean, right? In fact, enlistment stopped there early because local elites were worried about basically draining the labor supply, right? And so that even though the kind of relative numbers absolutely were small, per capita wise, they were substantial. I think another important thing was that there was there had been during the war, both tremendous inflation and war profiteering by the merchant elite in Belize, then called, of course, British Honduras. And so soldiers returned to a colony and found that, the wages that they were discharged with could not even support them for a full week, right? Once they were back in the colony. And so when they arrived, they came back with these hopes, right? These kind of grand promises that they would be given preferential access to jobs, that they would also kind of have discounts at local stores. And soon they actually, the kind of reality hit them, right? That many of the leading merchants were actively working to recruit returned white veterans from Britain and have them fill any available jobs rather than local Black veterans, and that the colonial state was unwilling to give them any kind of real financial compensation to help them resettle after their years of military service. And so these veterans committees started to form in Belize, like elsewhere across the region. Veterans also form organizations in Grenada, Jamaica, Trinidad. Even veterans who are living in Harlem form organizations, West Indian veterans in Harlem. But what we see in Belize is this kind of coming together of veterans' concerns, largely economic concerns, and kind of popular activism, often led by militant Black women around these bread and butter issues of getting access to kind of core goods in a state of hyperinflation. And so when those kind of concerns came together, you saw on the streets of Belize Town, veterans and civilians, men, women, and children, all in the streets together. And ultimately, though, that kind of shared civilian soldier uprising was ultimately put down by a group of reformist veterans and officials from the colonial government. You asked another terrific question about Marcus Garvey and Garvey's, I feel like, underappreciated role in World War I mobilization in Jamaica. So one of the very first things the Universal Negro Improvement Association does after its founding in August of 1914 is to issue a series of public letters, one to the British Prime Minister and one to the French President, supporting the Allied war effort. And then when the British West Indies Regiment is founded in 1915, Marcus Garvey explicitly, often during UNIA meetings, encourages men to enlist and argues that famously argues that, quote, it was the duty of every true son of the empire to serve. Garvey, like many other Black activists, however, as news came home from soldiers about the racism and brutality that they were experiencing during the war, quickly and ultimately renounces that position, right? By the end of the war, he's arguing, right, that Black men should no longer serve in colonial militaries, right? And that it was, in his words, a kind of new day, right? It was a new day for Black folks, and that the kind of efforts to pursue rights through military service should no longer be seen as a viable strategy.
You also know, of course, that Black Americans, African Americans, fought in World War I on behalf of Washington, and there has been a lot of writing about the Harlem Hellfighters, for example. Any comparisons or contrasts between Black American soldiers and soldiers from the British Caribbean?
I think that there are many commonalities. I think that for both groups of soldiers, the war really highlighted the hypocrisy of the language of a war for democracy, and the stark and brutal racism that Black troops, whether they were fighting under the US flag, the Union Jack, the French tricolor, or another flag, right, were all experiencing. So I think that the kind of the clear violation of any understanding or any commitment to racial equality or ideals of self-determination and justice for Black soldiers was a commonality that linked African American and Afro-Caribbean troops. Also, both groups of soldiers disproportionately served in non-combatant roles. Of course, the Harlem Hellfighters, right, are an exception to that. And there were also a small number of British West Indies regiment soldiers who also deployed in combat. But both groups of soldiers overwhelmingly spent the war doing backbreaking non-combatant labor. So often working on the same docks in France, for instance, loading and unloading ships, carrying, moving munitions, unloading trains, and doing a host of other form of non-combatant labor. So that is another important commonality. One difference, though, is that the British West Indies Regiment, as I mentioned before, was an all-volunteer unit. So men were not conscripted into it, right? The United States, like metropolitan Britain, implements a draft. So many African Americans did not volunteer to serve under the U.S. Army. They were forced to do so. And I think that ultimately was an important part of why West Indian soldiers argued that the British colonial government owed them even more, right? Because they had willingly, right, entered into military service under the premise that they would be treated as equals to white soldiers, a premise that ultimately turned out to be false.
Now, what about Cuba, Haiti, for example? Any reverberations or commonalities with regard to the experiences of their nationals compared to those in the United States and the larger Caribbean?
I think Cuba and Haiti are important counterpoints at this moment. Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, as the kind of independent nations in the Caribbean during World War I, had the ability, right, though of course Haiti and the Dominican Republic are literally occupied by US forces during World War I, right, to set their own kind of agenda in terms of the war. So those three nations do not send troops, right, to fight in World War I. But one important commonality that I think helps us to understand the importance of the war elsewhere in the Caribbean is that the region has a kind of long-standing tradition of military service and of kind of popular leaders emerging from the military, right? So if we think about a place like Haiti, where many of the early leaders of independent Haiti, of course, had been military officers during the Haitian Revolution. Similarly in Cuba, Cuba had a fully integrated military, the Cuban Liberation Army, during its 30-year struggle for independence between 1868 and 1898, including an important cadre of Black generals, the most famous being Antonio Maceo, but he was certainly not alone. And so I think that this example of Black military service being a springboard for political leadership, also the importance of veterans organizing, laid a kind of groundwork for West Indian soldiers to follow in the 20th century.
Finally, Reena Goldthree, Associate Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, author of the book Democracy's Foot Soldiers. What's next on your agenda?
So I'm currently working on two projects that in important ways grew out of the book. The first, and this also connects to your question about Cuba and Haiti, is about the role of Afro-Caribbean intellectuals in both identifying and contesting the rise of U.S. empire since the 19th century. I'm really, in my new book project, exploring the ways in which both intellectuals and working class folks, since at least the 1870s in the Caribbean, were closely monitoring U.S. overseas aggression in the Caribbean and warning that the rise of the United States as an imperial power in the Caribbean would have disastrous consequences for Black people in the region and people of color globally. And so in my new book project, I'm exploring this long history of Afro-Caribbean critique of U.S. empire beginning in the 19th century. I'm also completing a series of articles about Afro-Cuban and Afro-Puerto Rican intellectuals' contributions to the Harlem Renaissance, and thinking about the role of the Spanish language Black press in Harlem, which included Spanish language columns often printed in African American newspapers. So the New York Age had a Spanish language column in the 1920s. Of course, the Negro World is famous for its both Spanish and French language columns. So I'm really, in that project, thinking about the ways in which multilingualism was an important component of Harlem Renaissance conceptions of the new Negro, and the ways in which there are actually lots of connections between Black intellectuals from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and Anglophone intellectuals, including both African Americans and Black West Indians.
Well, I assure you, we all look forward to the publication of those works, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Goldthree. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
It's been a pleasure. I'm grateful to you and all of your listeners.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Elizabeth Schmidt, Reena Goldthree. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Brother Brandon, Sister Flora, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archives scroll to Freedom Now. Stay tuned from 12 to 1 p.m. is our brother Dino with The Signal. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.